There comes a time in life when we make a simple but strange decision. You're going to say something, your opinion, something you believe, and suddenly you freeze. You feel a hesitation you can't explain, a weight, a faceless pressure. And then, without realizing it, you change your mind, you correct yourself, you stay silent, you believe it was out of prudence, but it wasn't. It was obedience to a voice that's no longer there, an old voice, without an owner, living inside your head. And maybe you don't even know when it came in. Maybe it has the tone of your father, or the figure he represented. And here we're not talking about biology nor affection, but about psychic structure, about an archetype that settles early and over time stops protecting and starts commanding. What the Stoics called the inner tyranny, today we might call it an unburied father. Not dead, just too alive, inside you. Curious how it appears, right? Not with screams, but with suggestions. Not with orders, but with expectations. It says things like it won't work and this is dangerous and you're exaggerating. And you obey, but you don't know whom. Because the real father has already aged, changed, maybe even left. But the other, the symbolic one, remains intact, untouched, installed like an invisible judge, watching your gestures, your decisions, your silences. And you call this conscience. But is it really? Or is it just an old code that was never updated? Stoicism goes straight to that wound. It shows that there are voices inside us that are not ours, that were inherited, that became automatic, and only lucid, trained, present reason can reverse this process. But before freeing the mind, you have to recognize the prison. So before getting into the content, I ask you one simple but important thing. Subscribe here, because this kind of reflection doesn't end today. It unfolds, deepens, grows in layers. And this space here is for that, for cultivating thought that isn't satisfied with the obvious. And more. Leave in the comments a phrase, a memory, a discomfort. What has this invisible father stopped you from doing? What have you postponed just to avoid disappointing anyone? It can be a small gesture, an old story. It can be a doubt. What matters is to let the voice come out, this time yours, because now we're going to start a journey. And maybe at its end you'll discover that the voice that commanded so much was never really yours. There is a voice that lives inside us, and it's not really ours. It appears when we make mistakes, when we hesitate, when we dare to change. It says it won't work, that it's dangerous, that we're being selfish, ungrateful, childish. This voice knows the exact tone to make us doubt ourselves. And worse, it speaks as if it's taking care of us. But it's not. It's repeating old orders, phrases heard in childhood, judgments we inherited as absolute truths. The Stoics, masters of inner freedom, understood this phenomenon with impressive clarity. They didn't call it the inner father, but described its actions with surgical precision. It's the instance that binds us to unconscious rules, feeds guilt, and prevents conscious choices. It's an invisible, internalized figure that represents all forms of authority we once feared. Parents, teachers, dogmas, social norms. And it disguises itself as conscience, when in reality it's just repetition. The Stoics taught, with firmness and tenderness, that it's necessary to abandon the inner father to live authentically. It's not about disrespect or rebellion, but a necessary rite of passage. Breaking with this voice is taking a definitive step toward philosophical maturity. It is silencing the judge and finally listening to awakened reason. The path is hard, but liberating. And with every choice made with clarity, every impulse controlled with wisdom, we leave a little more behind this shadow that inhabits us. And finally walk toward ourselves. Before understanding how to abandon the inner father, it is necessary to realize how he was born. And usually he is born early, when we are still fragile, impressionable, open to everything the world shows us. Every harsh scolding poorly digested, every unexplained demand, every conditional affection, all of this sculpts an invisible presence inside us, a kind of ghost authority that, over the years, gains its own voice, The child learns quickly. To be loved, they need to obey. To avoid punishment, they need to hide their desires, and so, even without meaning to, they begin to censor themselves before anyone else says anything. This is the embryo of the inner father, a voice born to protect us, but that over time begins to control us. When we grow up, we no longer need real punishments, because the punishment becomes internal. Disapproval lives inside the head, and obedience becomes a second skin. We call it responsibility, but it's just fear in disguise. Stoicism looks at this dynamic with a calm but relentless gaze. Epictetus said that no one is free while reacting automatically to the world, and this applies as much to pain as to conditioning. Much of what we call personality is, in fact, a collection of emotional strategies to survive childhood. But these strategies, which once made sense, are now obstacles. The inner father lives off these undigested memories, these inherited guilts, these voices that continue echoing even after people have gone. The Stoic begins to free themselves when they realize this. When they look inside and say, "This order I am obeying, where did it come from? Does it serve me or sabotage me?" And it's not easy to do this. It requires courage to go against what we've learned to call common sense. It requires maturity to realize that sometimes what seems sensible is just a reflection of the fear of making mistakes, disappointing, being rejected. That's why the first step is not to fight the inner father, but to recognize him, to give him a name, a shape, a story, and then start doubting him. That's where transformation begins. When you realize that constant pressure, that feeling of never being good enough, that irrational rush, are just poorly cared for emotional inheritances. And worse, they aren't even yours. They were passed down from generation to generation as absolute truths. The Stoics didn't speak about healing emotional wounds in those words, but what they proposed was essentially that: to stop being a hostage to feelings we don't understand. For them, freedom begins when we can pause and think before reacting. When a negative thought arises and instead of believing it, we investigate. When an impulse to blame ourselves appears and we ask, is this fair? Is this rational? The inner father does not disappear overnight. But he loses power every time we choose with clarity, every time we act with awareness, not with fear, every time we dare to be who we are, even if that contradicts everything we were told we should be. But if obedience is what we were taught as virtue, then maybe it's time to revisit that idea too. We learn early on that obedience is good, that following rules is a sign of maturity, that doing what is expected of us, even when it hurts, is proof of character. Obedience becomes a moral ideal. But almost no one asks, obedience to whom? To what? Why? The inner father takes advantage of this gap. He dresses up as virtue. He speaks as if he were the voice of conscience, but he is just an old echo of fear and submission. He convinces us that opposing him is being ungrateful, selfish, rebellious. And so, little by little, we adapt to what he commands. We refuse opportunities out of precaution, silence desires out of humility, fail to assert ourselves out of respect. But deep down, there is something that bothers us, a discomfort that doesn't go away, because we know, even if vaguely, that we are living according to a script we didn't write. And the Stoics saw this with unsettling clarity. It is not virtuous to obey without thinking. It is virtuous to act with awareness, even if that goes against everything we were taught. What the Stoics propose is not empty rebellion, but lucid responsibility. They say, obey, yes, when reason agrees, but never out of fear, guilt, or habit. True ethics doesn't come from outside. It is born from trained conscience which judges calmly, chooses firmly, errs and learns with freedom. The problem with automatic obedience is that it paralyzes thought, and when thought falls silent, freedom dies. The inner father loves it when we don't question, when we accept silently, when we convince ourselves that being good is just not causing trouble. But true goodness is active. It is the one that takes risks. That says no when everyone expects a yes. That holds a position even if it costs approval. Obeying can be more comfortable, but it is also the shortest path to self-abandonment. And there is no virtue where there is no presence. There is no dignity in erasing yourself to fit into someone else's frame, even if that someone lives inside us. Maybe the hardest part is realizing that we were praised for this obedience, that it brought us affection, recognition, status. It made us good children, good students, good co-workers. And then the dilemma arises, if I stop obeying, will I stop being loved? The inner father whispers, yes. But real life shows otherwise. When you start acting truthfully, something changes. The bonds that relied on expectation begin to unravel, but those born from authenticity, they bloom stronger. The Stoics remind us that ultimately, it is better to displease others than to betray yourself. That there is no honor in living according to standards that erase us, and that virtue is not in obedience, but in integrity. But this integrity has a price, the initial loneliness of those who stop following old voices to listen, for the first time, to their own reason. And this moment of silence can be frightening, but it is also the birth of freedom. And now with this space created, maybe it's time to ask, how to cultivate this firm reason that silences the inner father without turning into chaos. Epictetus was not born free, he was enslaved. But even living under physical chains, he understood something that many free men never did. No one can dominate the spirit of someone who governs their own mind. This is the essence of Stoic thought, and it is also the first blow against the inner father. Because this internal authority does not control us with chains, but with ideas. It does not imprison us with violence, but with emotional obedience. And this is where Epictetus teaches. True freedom begins when we separate what is under our control from what is not. We cannot control the past, nor what others think, nor the old commands echoing in our minds. But we can choose what we do with all of that. We can observe thoughts without obeying them. We can feel impulses without acting on them. We can silently disagree with the voice that has dictated our reactions for so long. And when that happens, it is as if a space opens within the soul. A space where, for the first time, we can breathe. This space is the realm of reason. Not cold, calculating reason that suppresses emotions, but awakened reason, which welcomes emotions without being dragged by them. Epictetus said, we should not try to change the world. We should change our relationship with it. And that includes the world inside us. The inner father, with his inflexible commands, begins to weaken when we stop reacting automatically. When faced with an internal demand, instead of giving in or blaming ourselves, we stop and ask, is this fair? Is this useful? Does this free me or imprison me? This kind of questioning requires practice. It is almost like training a new muscle. Stoic reason does not aim to eliminate emotions, it wants to educate them. It wants to transform them into allies, because freedom is not in not feeling, but in not bowing to every feeling that arises, and that changes everything. When reason takes the helm, life stops being a battlefield against itself, and begins to be a path of presence, clarity, and direction. But there is a subtle detail Epictetus would never ignore. Even with awakened reason, the inner father tries to come back. It adapts, takes on new tones. It can pretend to be reason itself. It can lead us to excesses of self-control, to a rigidity that paralyzes instead of liberates. That is why vigilance is continuous. The Stoic lives in a state of attention, not like someone who distrusts everything, but like someone who has learned to listen deeply. He does not deceive himself by the tone of the internal voice. He tests, confronts, observes, and when he realizes something is trying to command his action out of fear, guilt, or vanity, he breathes and chooses again. Always again. Because Stoic freedom is not a destination, it is a daily exercise, a commitment to lucidity, a silent vow of integrity, and perhaps this is the great secret. It is not about defeating the inner father once and for all, but about letting reason gradually replace the old tyranny with a new kind of authority, firm, serene, and deeply human. but how to live this freedom without it turning into abandonment, selfishness, or indifference. In many ancient cultures, becoming an adult required going through a rite of passage. There were tests, farewells, transformations. Something died, something was born. In Stoicism, this rite is not done with fire or blood, but with awareness. Abandoning the inner father is this kind of rite. It is not about hating the real paternal figure, nor denying the importance of those who shaped us, but about accepting that there comes a time when we need, symbolically, to kill them within ourselves, not out of cruelty, but for freedom. As long as the inner father is alive in its original form, with its decrees, fears, and demands, we will remain obedient children trying to please ghosts. Maturity only begins when we have the courage to say, "I appreciate what you tried to teach me, but now I follow my own steps." And that, of course, hurts. Because along with the symbolic father, our crutches also die. The ready excuse dies, the victim role dies, the old comfort zone dies. The Stoics knew that growing up means losing, that there is no lucidity without renunciation. When we abandon the inner father, we also abandon the childish hope of being guided by someone who always knows what is best for us. This is the hardest part, realizing that the security we so desperately seek outside, in advice, orders, conduct manuals, simply does not exist. And now, it is up to us to choose, to fail, to restart. The inner father protected us from that weight, told us what to do, punished us when we deviated. He was harsh but clear. By leaving him, we enter a kind of internal desert. No map, no guarantees, only the compass of reason. But it is precisely in this barren space that autonomy is born. The Stoic learns to trust something deeper than external certainties, their own conscience. A conscience that does not command, but guides, that does not impose, but converses, that does not judge harshly, but with truth. This is the new place of authority, built not by repetition, but by reflection. But this process is neither clean nor linear. Many times we try to kill the inner father, and he returns, more subtle, more persuasive. Other times we confuse freedom with irresponsibility and end up spinning around the ego. That is why the Stoic rite demands continuous vigilance and constant humility. It is not enough to wake up once. It is necessary to remain awake. At every decision, every impulse, every dilemma, the question returns. Am I acting out of conviction or obeying an old order? And over time, this becomes habit. Lucidity turns into a kind of silent presence. You no longer need to fight the inner father because he no longer rules you. He is there, sometimes trying to return, but you recognize him, smile inside, and choose differently. This is the rite of Stoic maturity, not an aggressive break, but a firm transition. A necessary farewell made with respect but without attachment. But once free from the voice that once dictated so much, how do you find true peace, without internal silence turning into emptiness or indifference? When the inner father begins to quiet, something strange happens. The space he occupied inside us initially feels too empty. We are so used to living under constant pressure, judgment, and surveillance that the absence of all that can feel like disorientation. The mind asks, is that all? Can I really choose without guilt? Can I rest without having to justify? Can I say no without proving anything? Serenity at first seems like absence, but what it truly is pure presence. A presence without tension, without vigilance, without a tribunal installed in the chest. The Stoics called this apatheia, not in the sense of coldness or indifference, but liberation from uncontrolled emotions. When we are no longer dragged by emotions we do not understand, when we don't need to explain ourselves at every step, this inner silence arises. A silence that does not repress, but supports. That does not correct, but welcomes. To inhabit this state is perhaps one of the greatest achievements of Stoic philosophy. But serenity requires practice, because the world outside remains noisy. Expectations keep coming. Old habits sometimes want to return. And even the ego can try to take the place of the inner father, now disguised as authenticity. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking freedom is doing whatever you want, without criteria. But the Stoic knows freedom without direction turns into chaos. Serenity is not the absence of conflict, it is mature presence amid chaos. It is knowing that others can criticize and still not react reflexively. It is being able to make mistakes and still maintain dignity. It is understanding that control is not in the world, but in how you interpret it, and that can only be achieved with consistency, with small, conscious choices, with pauses before responding, with decisions that do not come from anxiety, but from discernment. Gradually, the silence of the internal judge stops being frightening and starts to protect, because it is no longer absence of authority, it is presence of conscience. And the most beautiful thing is that when this serenity settles, it changes everything around us. Relationships become lighter, conflicts lose their drama, productivity stops being pressure and becomes expression. Time slows down inside, the gaze gains depth. We are no longer trying to prove anything, just live with truth. The inner father, now asleep, may appear in moments of weakness, but he no longer has power, because we are no longer the same. We have passed through the right, faced doubt, cultivated reason, and now we inhabit another space, simpler, more solid, calmer. This doesn't mean life got easy, but it became more authentic. And this authenticity is what the Stoics called living virtue, that which manifests daily in silent choices, in peace without spectacle. But there is one last turn in this journey. After silencing the inner father, who begins to guide us? There is a moment, almost imperceptible, when everything changes. There are no fireworks, no grand epiphanies, just an instant when we realize we are guiding ourselves, that we no longer ask anyone's permission to exist, that the choice comes from within, not from the need for approval. At this point in the Stoic journey, there is no longer a need to replace the inner father with another authority, because mature conscience already knows the way. It has learned to listen, to wait, to weigh. It no longer moves by impulse, nor by fear. And it doesn't need to assert its freedom all the time, it simply acts. This is where the most silently powerful decisions are born, those that don't shout, but transform. The Stoics called this living according to rational nature, not instinctive nature, but the one that knows how to discern what is essential. Becoming your own guide is not being infallible, it is knowing how to learn from every stumble. It is continuing even when there are still doubts. It is having principles that support but don't stiffen, and above all it is recognizing that what once was a prison today is fertile ground for conscious choices. Being your own guide is an exercise in humility and responsibility. Because now, if something goes wrong, there is no one else to blame. There is no more, "I was told it was this way," or "that's what I learned." There is only, "I chose." But this responsibility does not weigh. It frees. Because with it comes the lightness of no longer needing to fit into outdated molds. Life ceases to be a test and becomes expression. We no longer live to achieve an ideal, but to live with wholeness. The inner father, if he still appears, no longer commands. He only reminds us who we were. And sometimes we even thank him for having existed, because it was his shadow that pushed us toward the light of reason. In the end, he prepared us unintentionally for being what he himself could not be, free. The Stoics knew that this freedom was not an automatic right, but a daily achievement, a way of being in the world with depth, presence, and discernment. And perhaps this is the greatest legacy, not to be heir to rules but creator of paths. And now that the inner father has been recognized, confronted, and finally abandoned, something new begins, a new listening, a new silence, a new kind of voice, yours. That no longer commands but guides, that no longer judges but cares, that no longer demands but inspires. And if you have come this far, perhaps you have already felt this movement. Perhaps you have already realized how much your decisions were shaped by voices that were not yours, and how liberating it is to break from that gradually with courage, with truth. Now tell me, what kind of inner father still lives in you? What does he still try to stop you from doing? What would your life be like if you started today to guide it yourself? Leave your experience, insight, or doubt in the comments. This exchange is what keeps this space alive. And if this journey made sense to you, subscribe here. There is much depth coming, and perhaps walking together, even in silence, is also a form of freedom.